Before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a huge difference for us. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in. If you enjoy these deep dives into the mysteries and conspiracies that shaped our world, consider subscribing. It means everything, and a massive thank you to Jeff Anon for suggesting tonight's story. This one's a chilling piece of history that almost no one talks about. In early November 1983, military screens across Eastern Europe began lighting up with signals that looked exactly like the prelude to nuclear war. Encrypted transmissions flooded NATO channels. High-ranking officials disappeared into secure bunkers. Nuclear-capable aircraft moved into position. But this was supposed to be just a drill, an exercise, a simulation, except one side believed it was real. What you're about to hear is the story of Able Archer 83. The weaker training exercise nearly triggered the apocalypse. It's the story of how the world came within a hair's breadth of nuclear annihilation, not because of aggression or malice, but because of misunderstanding. And it's the story of why, for decades, almost no one was told just how close we came. This is the week the world almost ended. Chapter 1. A World on Edge. To understand Able Archer. 83. You have to understand the world it happened in. 1983 was not a good year to be alive on planet Earth. The Cold War, that decades-long standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, had entered one of its most dangerous phases. The brief thaw of détente in the 70s had frozen over. Trust between East and West had evaporated. In its place was something far more volatile: paranoia. Ronald Reagan had been in the White House for nearly 3 years, and his approach to the Soviets was aggressive in ways the previous administration had never been. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire in public speeches. He authorized the largest peacetime military build-up in American history. He talked openly about winning a nuclear war, about Star Wars missile defense systems, about confronting communism wherever it existed. To Americans tired of feeling weak after Vietnam and the hostage crisis in Iran, Reagan's rhetoric was invigorating. To the Soviets, it sounded like the warmongering of a man preparing for war. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, Yuri Andropov had recently taken control of the Soviet Union. Andropov was not well. The former head of the KGB was suffering from kidney failure, spending more time in hospitals than in the Kremlin. But illness had not softened him. If anything, it had. Made him more suspicious, more convinced that the West was planning something catastrophic. Andropov had spent his career in intelligence. He knew how to read signals. He knew how to spot patterns. And in 1983, every signal he saw pointed to war. Earlier that year, on September 1st, Soviet fighters had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian Boeing 747 carrying 269 people. The plane had drifted into Soviet airspace, and in the climate of suspicion that dominated Moscow, military commanders made a decision. They fired. Everyone on board died, including a sitting United States congressman. The international outrage was immediate and fierce. Reagan called it an act of barbarism. The Soviets, rather than apologizing, doubled down. They claimed the plane was on a spy mission, that it was deliberately probing their defences. Conspiracy theories erupted on both sides. Was it really an accident? Was it a setup? Did the Americans send that plane into Soviet airspace on purpose to provoke a response? Did the Soviets shoot it down knowing it was civilian just to send a message? The truth most likely was simpler and sadder than either conspiracy. It was a tragic mistake born of fear. But in the autumn of 1983, no one was in the mood for simple explanations. The world was on edge. The superpowers were glaring at each other across a line that had been drawn in blood and concrete. And into this atmosphere of mistrust and tension, NATO introduced an exercise called Able Archer 83. But to truly understand the paranoia of 1983, you need to understand what daily life felt like in that moment. In American living rooms, television shows were interrupted with updates about Soviet troop movements in Afghanistan. In European capitals, peace protesters filled the streets. opposing the deployment of American Pershing II missiles on their soil. These weren't symbolic weapons. They were intermediate-range nuclear missiles that could strike Moscow in less than 10 minutes from launch. The Soviets had their own equivalent systems pointed west, SS-20s that could turn London, Paris or Bonn into ash before anyone had time to evacuate. The nuclear arsenals of both superpowers had reached obscene levels. The United States possessed more than 10,000 strategic nuclear warheads. The Soviet Union had roughly the same, but it wasn't just about quantity. It was about hair trigger alert status. Submarines lurked beneath the Arctic ice, their missile tubes loaded and ready. Bomber crews lived on bases with their aircraft fueled and armed, prepared to launch within 15 minutes of receiving orders. Missile silos across the Great Plains and the Siberian steppes were manned around the clock, their crews running through launch checklists during endless shifts, trained to turn 2 keys simultaneously the moment the order came. This was the doctrine of launch on warning. Both sides had adopted it because both sides feared a decapitation strike, a surprise attack designed to destroy leadership and command centres before they could retaliate. If you waited until you confirmed that enemy missiles were actually incoming, it might be too late. Your communications might be cut. Your commanders might be dead. Your missiles might be destroyed in their silos. So the policy became, if you see something that looks like an attack, launch everything immediately. Don't wait for confirmation. Don't hesitate. Just fire. Mad, mutually assured destruction only works if the other side knows you'll retaliate, and you can't retaliate if you're already dead. This created a system where false alarms became existentially dangerous. In 1983 alone, there had been multiple incidents where early warning systems malfunctioned. Radar operators saw phantom bomber formations that turned out to be flocks of geese, satellite sensors registered missile launches that were actually sunlight reflecting off clouds. Computer errors generated attack warnings that required human operators to make split-second decisions. Is this real, or is this a glitch? Every time, someone chose correctly. Every time, disaster was averted. But every time, the margin of error got smaller. And then there were the war games. Both sides played them constantly. Psychological operations designed to probe the other's reactions, to test response times, to gather intelligence on procedures. Soviet bombers would fly toward NATO airspace, forcing Western fighters to scramble, testing how quickly they could get airborne. American submarines would shadow Soviet ballistic missile subs, seeing how close they could get before being detected. It was a constant game of chicken played with nuclear weapons. The problem was that all these provocations, all these tests, all these exercises created a baseline of tension so high that distinguishing between routine provocation and actual attack preparation became nearly impossible. The Soviets were used to NATO running exercises. NATO was used to Soviet aggressive maneuvers. It was background noise in a world where everyone was always on edge. But Able Archer wasn't going to be background noise. Able Archer was going to be different in ways that nobody fully understood yet. And those differences, those small changes in procedure and participation, were going to bring the world closer to annihilation than any deliberate act of aggression ever had. Chapter 2. What Able Archer was supposed to be NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, held military exercises constantly. It was part of maintaining readiness. In the event of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe, NATO needed to know that its member nations could work together, that communication systems functioned, that chains of command held. Exercises were routine, they were scheduled, they were predictable. Able Archer was supposed to be one of those exercises. It was a command post exercise, sometimes called a CPX. That meant it wasn't about moving tanks or flying combat missions. There would be no troops in the field, no shots fired, not even blanks. Instead, Able Archer was a simulation conducted from headquarters and bunkers, a test of whether NATO's leadership could coordinate a response to Soviet aggression. It was a tabletop exercise on a massive scale. The scenario was straightforward, at least on paper. NATO commanders would simulate a period of rising tensions with the Warsaw Pact. They would practice issuing orders, moving imaginary units, coordinating between nations, and crucially, They would simulate the procedures for escalating to nuclear release, the process by which NATO's nuclear arsenal would be authorised and deployed. Previous Able Archer exercises had been held before. They happened annually. Everyone knew the rhythm. NATO would run the drill, the Soviets would watch with mild interest, and everything would go back to normal. It was theatre. Everyone understood it was theatre. But Able Archer 83 was different. The exercise was scheduled to run from November 2nd to November 11th, 1983. From the outset, NATO planners decided to make this iteration more realistic than any before. They wanted to test their systems under conditions that mimicked actual war as closely as possible. They wanted to see if the mechanisms of nuclear command and control could function under pressure, so they changed the script. They introduced radio silence periods, simulating communications blackouts that would occur during war. They used new, encrypted communication systems that Soviet signals intelligence had never seen before. They moved the exercise through DEFCON levels in a way that mirrored how a real conflict might escalate. And most significantly, they incorporated participation from the highest levels of NATO leadership. Previous Able Archer drills had been run by mid-level officers. This one would involve officials at the level who would actually authorise nuclear strikes. The exercise would simulate the release of nuclear weapons with a degree of verisimilitude that had never been attempted before. To NATO, this made perfect sense. If you're going to test a system, test it realistically. If you're going to practice for the apocalypse, practice seriously. But here's the problem. From the outside, how would anyone know this was fake? Chapter 3. When the drill changed. Able Archer. 83 began on November the 2nd with what NATO considered standard procedures. Commands were issued. Units, fictional units, began moving through the simulation. Headquarters staff settled into the rhythm of the exercise. But within the first 48 hours, something unusual happened. Soviet intelligence officers monitoring NATO communications noticed the changes immediately. The radio traffic was different. Frequencies that had been quiet were suddenly active. Encryption patterns had shifted. NATO forces were using communication protocols that Soviet analysts had never intercepted before. Then came the movement of personnel. Senior NATO officials began leaving their normal posts and heading to secure locations. In previous exercises, this hadn't happened. Colonels and generals ran the drills. But in early November 1983, ambassadors and ministers started disappearing into bunkers. The kind of people who would actually be involved in authorising nuclear war were participating in the exercise. To NATO, this was exactly the point. They were testing the full chain of command. But to Soviet observers, it looked like the West was preparing for something real. Let's walk through what happened day by day, hour by hour, from both perspectives. November 2nd, Day 1. At Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE, located in Casto, Belgium, the exercise began at 0800 hours Central European Time. The scenario called for a period of rising political tensions between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Simulated intelligence reports indicated Soviet troop build-ups along the East German border. Fictional diplomatic protests were drafted. The exercise moved slowly, deliberately, giving participants time to practice coordination. In Moscow, intelligence analysts at the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, began receiving reports from their agents in Western Europe. NATO communication patterns had changed. The volume of encrypted traffic had increased significantly. Routine messages that usually went over standard channels were now being sent through secure networks. The GRU flagged this as unusual but not yet alarming. They'd seen exercises before. They noted it in their daily reports and continued monitoring. November 3rd, Day 2. The exercise scenario escalated. The fictional Soviet invasion of fictional Western Europe began in the simulation. NATO commanders practiced issuing defensive orders. Imaginary units moved to imaginary positions. But the communications about these movements were real. The radio traffic was authentic. The encryption was genuine military-grade cryptography, and the movements weren't entirely imaginary. As part of the exercise realism, certain NATO aircraft were actually relocated. Not fighters or bombers carrying live weapons, but reconnaissance aircraft and command and control planes that would be used in an actual war. They moved to dispersal airfields, spreading out to avoid being caught bunched together if an enemy strike occurred. This was standard procedure for a realistic exercise. But to Soviet radar operators tracking these movements, the dispersal looked exactly like what NATO would do if they were actually preparing for war. In East Germany, Soviet commanders began asking questions. Their intelligence officers couldn't explain why this exercise felt different. The previous, year's Able Archer had been straightforward. This one had new elements they hadn't briefed on. Orders came down from Moscow. Increase observation. Double the number of reconnaissance flights. Report any unusual activity immediately. November 4th, Day 3. This was when Able Archer introduced one of its most provocative new elements, radio silence. For 6 hours, NATO went almost completely dark. Routine communication frequencies fell silent. The normal chatter of military coordination vanished. In its place, only occasional bursts of heavily encrypted transmissions on frequencies that weren't part of the standard NATO communications architecture. From the Western perspective, this made perfect sense. In an actual war, the Soviets would target communication systems immediately. NATO needed to practice operating under communications blackout conditions. They needed to prove they could maintain command and control even when normal channels were down. From the Soviet perspective, this looked like NATO was hiding something. When you're about to launch a surprise attack, one of the first things you do is impose radio silence. You stop broadcasting your position. You stop giving away your intentions. You go dark, and then you strike. Soviet signals intelligence stations across Eastern Europe reported the silence to Moscow. The reports landed on desks at the KGB, at the GRU, at Soviet military headquarters. Analysts cross-referenced the timing. The silence had begun at 1400 hours Central European time. NATO aircraft had dispersed the previous day. Senior officials had moved to bunkers. Encrypted communications had increased. And now, silence. The indicators were stacking up. November 5th, Day 4. The exercise scenario reached a critical threshold. In the simulation, NATO forces were being pushed back by the fictional Soviet invasion. Conventional defences were failing. The scenario called for NATO to contemplate the use of tactical nuclear weapons, small battlefield nukes designed to stop advancing armour columns. This was where Able Archer moved into genuinely unprecedented territory. Previous exercises had generally stopped before the nuclear threshold. They'd practice conventional response, work through logistics and coordination, and then wrap up. But Able Archer 83 was designed to test the entire escalation ladder. NATO wanted to know if their procedures for nuclear release actually worked, so they practiced them. Specific messages were sent using the actual formatting and authentication codes that would be used in a real nuclear release order. Obviously, the authorization codes themselves were simulated. The alphanumeric strings that would actually unlock weapon systems were kept secure. But everything else was real. The message formats, the communication channels, the backup procedures, the confirmation protocols. At NATO's nuclear weapons storage sites across Europe, security forces were briefed on the exercise scenario. Some bases ran drills where, as part of the simulation, they practiced the procedures for mating nuclear warheads to delivery systems. They didn't actually bring weapons and aircraft together. That would have been dangerous and provocative. But they rehearsed the choreography. They timed how long it would take. They tested whether the communication systems could reliably transmit release authorization from headquarters to the individual units that would carry out strikes. And Soviet intelligence watched all of it. Agents operating near NATO bases reported increased security activity. Perimeter patrols were reinforced. Access procedures were tightened. At several locations, personnel with specific technical qualifications, the kind of specialists needed to arm nuclear weapons, were seen entering high-security areas. In Moscow, the reports were compiled and analysed. The GRU produced an assessment that landed on Yuri Andropov's desk on the evening of November 5th. The assessment noted the unusual characteristics of Able Archer 83. It highlighted the participation of senior leadership. It emphasized the radio silence period. It pointed out the dispersal of aircraft and the increased activity at nuclear storage sites. The assessment concluded with a paragraph that, in retrospect, was chilling. The current NATO exercise demonstrates characteristics consistent with preparations for a surprise nuclear strike. While we cannot rule out that this is indeed a training exercise, the operational security measures and communication protocols observed exceed those of previous drills, recommend elevated readiness posture of Soviet forces pending clarification of NATO intentions, and Drop-Off, already predisposed to believe that the Americans were planning something, authorized the recommendation. Soviet military forces in Eastern Europe began moving to higher alert levels, and NATO had no idea, November 6th, day 5, this was the day that Able Archer simulated the decision to use strategic nuclear weapons, not just battlefield nukes, but intercontinental ballistic missiles and long-range bombers targeting the Soviet homeland. The exercise scenario had escalated to the point where fictional NATO was facing fictional defeat. Fictional Soviet armies were fictional miles from the English Channel. In this nightmare scenario, the alliance had to decide: accept defeat or escalate to full nuclear exchange. They chose escalation, at least in the simulation they did. The exercise controllers issued orders simulating the release of strategic nuclear forces. Messages went out to bomber bases. Simulated targeting packages were transmitted to missile commands. The scenario played out the choreography of Armageddon. From NATO's perspective, this was the whole point of the exercise. They needed to know that their command and control systems could handle the stress of nuclear decision-making. They needed to prove that the mechanisms for presidential or prime ministerial authorization could function under time pressure. They needed to test whether the multilateral complexity of a nuclear alliance, where multiple nations with different languages and procedures had to coordinate the end of the world, could actually work. From the Soviet perspective, this looked like NATO was practicing a first strike. Because here's the thing about nuclear strategy. There's no practical difference between practicing for a retaliatory second strike and practicing for an aggressive first strike. The procedures are the same, the communications are the same, the weapons are the same. If you're watching from the outside, you can't tell whether someone is rehearsing defense or rehearsing offense. And the Soviets, watching Able Archer unfold with increasing alarm, were starting to believe this wasn't defense. In the underground command centers beneath Moscow, military planners began running their own calculations. If NATO was indeed preparing to strike, what would Soviet response look like? How much warning would they have? How quickly could they get their own missiles and bombers launched? The answer to that last question was very quickly. Soviet doctrine emphasized rapid response. Their ICBMs were kept at high readiness. Their strategic bomber force practiced immediate launch procedures. If the order came down, they could begin launching within minutes. The machinery of response was being prepared. Systems were being checked. Crews were being briefed. Not because anyone had decided to start a war, but because following doctrine in the face of apparent threat required preparation. And preparation, when dealing with nuclear weapons, looks an awful lot like the beginning of the end of the world. Able Archer introduced simulated alert levels that mirrored actual NATO procedures for nuclear escalation. The exercise began at a low level of tension and gradually increased. Day by day, the simulated threat level rose. Imaginary Soviet forces invaded imaginary Western Europe. NATO's response escalated accordingly. The simulation moved from conventional defense to tactical nuclear release to strategic nuclear exchange. It followed the ladder of escalation perfectly, exactly as it would in a real war. Soviet intelligence agencies intercepted communications about dispersing nuclear-capable aircraft. They tracked simulated orders for missile units to prepare for launch. They watched as NATO practiced the procedures that would, in reality, precede the end of the world. And here's where the conspiracy framing becomes essential. If you were a Soviet intelligence analyst in November 1983, how would you distinguish between a very realistic exercise and actual war preparation? The answer is, you probably couldn't. NATO had made Able Archer so realistic, so different from previous drills, that it was functionally indistinguishable from the real thing. The exercise had crossed a line. It had become too convincing, and the Soviets were watching very, very closely. Chapter 4. The Soviet Lens. To understand Soviet reaction to Able Archer, you need to understand Operation Ryan. Ryan was a Soviet intelligence program that had been running since 1981. The name was an acronym in Russian, Raketno-Yadernoye Napadenie, which translates to nuclear missile attack. Operation Ryan was designed to detect indicators that the United States was preparing to launch a surprise nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union. This wasn't paranoia for its own sake. Soviet strategic thinking was based on a fundamental assumption, that the United States would attack first if it believed it could win. The whole concept of mutually assured destruction rested on both sides, knowing that neither could strike without being destroyed in return. But what if one side developed the capability to eliminate the other's nuclear arsenal before they could respond? What if Star Wars missile defense actually worked? What if NATO could decapitate Soviet leadership and destroy enough missiles that a counterattack would fail? These weren't abstract questions in Moscow, they were existential fears. Operation Ryan instructed Soviet intelligence officers around the world to watch for specific indicators. Were Western leaders suddenly travelling less? That might mean they were staying close to bunkers. Were blood banks in NATO countries increasing their stockpiles? That might mean preparation for casualties. Were there unusual movements of military personnel, changes in communication patterns, increased activity at nuclear weapons storage sites? The program was comprehensive, and by 1983 it was in full effect. Every Soviet embassy, every intelligence station, every agent in the West had a checklist of warning signs to monitor. And then Able Archer started. Suddenly every indicator on the Operation Ryan checklist began lighting up. NATO communications shifted to encrypted channels. Senior officials moved to secure locations. Nuclear-capable aircraft went on alert, at least according to the simulated exercise. But Soviet intelligence didn't always know what was simulation and what was real. From Moscow's perspective, this looked exactly like what they'd been told to watch for. This looked like the Americans were preparing to strike. Yuri Andropov was briefed on the developments. The dying leader of the Soviet Union, already deeply suspicious of Western intentions, received reports that NATO was rehearsing nuclear war with unprecedented realism. His intelligence chiefs told him this was different from previous drills. This was something new. And Andropov made a decision. If NATO was preparing for war, the Soviet Union needed to be ready to respond. Chapter 5. The alarms no one heard. What happened next is still partially classified, but enough has been declassified to reconstruct the basic outline, and it's terrifying. Soviet military forces in East Germany and Poland began moving to higher alert levels. This wasn't part of any exercise. This was real. Nuclear-capable aircraft, actual bombers carrying actual weapons, were placed on high readiness. Some reports suggest that pilots were briefed for immediate launch missions. Missile units received preparatory orders. The Soviet Union began responding to Able Archer as if it were the opening move of World War III. And NATO had no idea. Let's be specific about what higher alert levels actually means in this context, because the clinical language hides the reality of what was happening. At Fino Air Base in East Germany, crews of Soviet Yak-28 Brewer bombers were ordered to their aircraft on the morning of November the 7th. These weren't conventional bombers, they were nuclear strike aircraft, each capable of carrying a single tactical nuclear bomb. Under normal circumstances, even during exercises, these planes would sit on the flight line with their weapons stored separately in secure bunkers. The process of mating aircraft to nuclear weapons was elaborate, carefully controlled and documented. It didn't happen casually. But on November 7th, ground crews began the preparation procedures. Weapons storage igloos were opened, armed guards established perimeters. Technical personnel began the checklist for moving the weapons from storage to the aircraft. Reports suggest, though this has never been fully confirmed, that at least some aircraft were actually armed with live nuclear weapons during this period. Think about what that means. Soviet bombers sitting on runways in East Germany with nuclear bombs attached, pilots in cockpits or in ready rooms nearby, waiting for launch orders. These aircraft had a combat radius of about 1,000 kilometres. From Finnair they could reach targets across West Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium and northern France, within an hour of takeoff. Major NATO bases, command centres, cities, all within range. And this was real. This wasn't a simulation or an exercise or a drill. This was the Soviet Air Force preparing for actual nuclear combat operations in response to what they believed was an impending NATO attack. At the same time, Soviet missile units in western portions of the USSR began elevated readiness procedures. The SS-20 missiles, the same intermediate-range systems that peace protesters in Europe had been demonstrating against, were brought to higher states of preparation. These missiles were road-mobile, designed to be difficult to target. Under normal circumstances, they'd be dispersed in secure locations, their exact positions known only to their crews and command. But elevated readiness meant something different. Crews received briefings on potential targets. Launch coordinates were loaded into guidance computers. The missiles themselves were checked and rechecked. Fuel, systems were tested. The elaborate security protocols that govern nuclear weapons were stepped through, stage by stage, getting closer to the point where a launch order could be executed in minutes rather than hours. In the Baltic, Soviet submarines received coded messages instructing them to assume launch positions. These were Delta-class ballistic missile submarines, each carrying 16 SS N-18 missiles. Each missile could carry 3 nuclear warheads. A single submarine represented the destructive power to annihilate dozens of cities, and they were being moved into positions where they'd have optimal firing solutions on American targets. The pattern was consistent across Soviet forces in the European theatre. Preparation for immediate nuclear combat, not mobilization for conventional war. That would have been more visible, requiring massive troop movements and logistical preparations. This was the specific targeted readiness of nuclear forces getting ready to launch. And here's where the story becomes almost unbearable. While NATO commanders were running their simulation, while they were playing out scenarios and testing communication systems in bunkers and command posts across Europe, the other side was preparing for actual nuclear war. The exercise was producing real-world consequences that the people running the exercise didn't know about. Why didn't they know? Intelligence is supposed to prevent this. The United States had satellites watching Soviet military bases. The National Security Agency had listening posts intercepting Soviet communications. NATO's own intelligence apparatus monitored Warsaw Pact activities constantly. CIA operatives, MI6 agents, and other Western intelligence services had sources inside the Soviet military establishment. All of this existed. All of it was functioning. But none of it provided warning fast enough or clear enough to alert NATO to what was happening. Part of the problem was interpretation. Western satellites did pick up increased activity at Soviet air bases. Radio intercepts did note changes in communication patterns. But this was interpreted as the Soviets conducting their own exercises in response to NATO's Able Archer, which it was in a sense, except it wasn't an exercise. It was preparation for actual war motivated by the belief that Able Archer was a cover for a real NATO attack. The distinction is critical. NATO intelligence analysts, looking at Soviet activity through the lens of their own knowledge that Able Archer was just a drill, assumed Soviet responses were proportional. They thought, we're running an exercise, so the Soviets are running a counter-exercise. They're watching us practice, so they're practicing too. It made sense. It was logical. It was also catastrophically wrong. The Soviet responses weren't exercises. They were actual combat preparations. The bombers being armed were being armed with real weapons intended for real targets. The missiles being readied were being readied for real launches. The submarines moving into position were moving into position for real strikes. But from NATO headquarters, watching the intelligence reports come in, it looked routine. Soviet military activity increases during NATO exercises. That was expected. Nothing in the report screamed emergency. Nothing suggested that the other side genuinely believed war was imminent. And this raises the conspiracy question that haunts this entire event. Did Western intelligence actually miss the signals? Or did someone know and decide not to escalate by acknowledging it? There's a third possibility, more disturbing than either ignorance or deliberate concealment: selective awareness. It's possible that some intelligence analysts looking at the data began to suspect that Soviet responses were more serious than routine counter-exercises. It's possible that reports were written expressing concern. But in the bureaucratic machinery of Cold War intelligence, those concerns might not have been elevated properly. Reports might have been filed and forgotten, lost in the daily flood of intelligence data that poured into Western capitals. Or perhaps someone did recognise the danger and worked quietly to de-escalate without making it official. There are hints in declassified documents that back-channel communications may have occurred during Able Archer. Unofficial contacts between Western and Soviet intelligence officers, passing messages that couldn't be sent through formal diplomatic channels. Quiet assurances that this was indeed just an exercise, nothing more. We don't know for certain. The full truth may still be classified, or it may be buried in archives that haven't been fully explored, or it may exist only in the memories of people who were there and have chosen to remain silent. What we do know is that nuclear-armed forces on both sides were at heightened alert, and the public was going about their lives completely unaware. In London, people were shopping for Christmas gifts. The holiday season was approaching. In New York, the stock market was trading normally. In Moscow, citizens were queuing for bread and trying to stay warm as winter settled in. In Paris, in Rome, in Washington, in every city that would have been vaporized if the situation had spiraled just slightly further out of control, people were living ordinary lives. They had no idea that in East German air bases and Polish missile sites and underground command bunkers scattered across the Soviet Union, military officers were going through checklists that ended with nuclear launches. They didn't know that weapons were being armed, that coordinates were being loaded, that the machinery of apocalypse was humming to life. And maybe that ignorance was mercy. Maybe it was better not to know, because what could anyone have done? If the truth had been announced, if governments had gone on television and radio and said, "The Soviets think we're about to attack and they're preparing to launch their weapons," what would have happened? Panic, probably. Certainly panic. People trying to flee cities, runs on grocery stores, chaos in the streets, and that chaos might have convinced the Soviets that they were right, that the West was mobilizing for war, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where fear of war triggers the very war that was feared. So the silence continued. NATO ran its exercise. The Soviets prepared their response, and the world spun on, oblivious to how close it was to ending. Chapter 6. The Human Factor. The thing about nuclear weapons is that they don't launch themselves. Systems can be automated up to a point, but ultimately people make the decision. And in November 1983, that human element may be what saved us. Soviet doctrine required multiple layers of confirmation before nuclear release. Local commanders could prepare weapons, could move to launch positions, but they couldn't fire without authorization from Moscow. Even in the midst of Operation Ryan paranoia, even with Andropov receiving alarming reports about NATO activity, the system required human judgment, and humans hesitated. Let's talk about what hesitation looks like in a nuclear command bunker when you believe the end of the world might be starting. Imagine you're a Soviet Air Force commander at a base in East Germany. It's November 7th, 1983. You've received orders to bring your nuclear-capable bombers to high readiness. Your intelligence briefing told you that NATO appears to be preparing for a surprise attack. Your weapons are being armed. Your pilots are standing by. You're running through final checklists. And then you pause. You look at the orders again. You look at the intelligence assessment. You think about what you're being told versus what you're seeing. Yes, NATO communications have changed. Yes, senior officials have moved to bunkers. Yes, there's increased activity at weapon storage sites. But has anyone actually seen NATO forces mobilizing for attack? Have any bombers taken off? Have any missiles been fueled for launch? The intelligence says NATO is preparing, but preparing could mean many things. It could mean they're about to attack, or it could mean they're running a very realistic exercise, or it could mean they're responding to something else entirely, maybe to our own increased readiness. So you pick up the phone, you call your superior officer, you ask for clarification. Is this confirmed? Are we certain this isn't just their annual exercise? Should we really be arming weapons based on preparations rather than actual attacks? This conversation happened. We don't know exactly who had it or in precisely what form, but we know from declassified documents and from interviews with former Soviet military personnel that questions were asked, orders were questioned, confirmation was requested, and that questioning, that insistence on verification created delays. Time passed while reports were checked and double-checked. Minutes turned into hours, and those hours mattered. Because in nuclear strategy, timing is everything. If you're going to launch a surprise first strike, you do it decisively and completely. You don't give the enemy time to prepare, time to disperse forces, time to get their own weapons ready to launch. The whole point of a first strike is that it's sudden, overwhelming and paralysing. But Able Archer wasn't sudden. It had been running for days. It was escalating gradually, following a predictable timeline, and the more Soviet officers looked at that pattern, the less it looked like an actual attack, and the more it looked like exactly what it was, an exercise. There's a parallel here to Stanislav Petrov, the Soviet officer who, in September 1983, just 2 months before Able Archer, received what appeared to be confirmation that American ICBMs were inbound. His early warning system showed multiple launches. Protocol said to report it immediately, but Petrov made a judgment call. He decided it was a false alarm, reasoning that an actual first strike would involve hundreds of missiles, not just 5. He was right. It was a malfunction, and he prevented a retaliatory launch that would have started a nuclear war. Petrov became famous later when his story was declassified. The world learned that one man's judgment, one person's willingness to trust his analysis over his instruments, had prevented Armageddon. He was celebrated as the man who saved the world, though he himself always downplayed his role. He said he was just doing his job, just following his training, just using common sense. But how many other Petrovs were there during Able Archer? How many people in the Soviet chain of command looked at the data and said, "This doesn't quite add up"? How many times did someone reach for the phone to authorise a launch and then pause just for a moment and decide to wait for more information? We'll probably never know all their names. Some of them might not even realise they were part of this story. They might have thought they were just being appropriately cautious, just following good practice, just doing the thorough job their training required. They didn't know that their caution, their scepticism, their insistence on verification was the thin barrier between civilization and nuclear holocaust. Consider the perspective of an intelligence analyst in Moscow reading reports from the field. You've been told for months that the Americans might launch a surprise attack. You've been watching for indicators, and now, during Able Archer, many of those indicators are present. Your job is to assess the data and provide recommendations to military leadership. But you're also aware that intelligence can be wrong. You've seen exercises before. You know that NATO runs drills. You understand that increased activity during an exercise is normal, so you sit at your desk looking at the reports and you have to make a call. Is this the real thing? Or is this what a realistic exercise looks like? If you say it's real and you're wrong, you'll look foolish. You'll have panicked over nothing. Your career might suffer, but the world will continue. If you say it's an exercise and you're wrong, millions of people will die, and your country will be destroyed, including you, including everyone you know, including every city you've ever visited, and every person you've ever met. That's the decision, and it's not hypothetical. It's real. It's happening right now, in this moment, with actual weapons being armed, and actual bombers being fueled, and actual missile crews running through actual checklists. What do you do? The answer, thankfully, is that enough Soviet intelligence analysts chose caution. They wrote their assessments noting the unusual characteristics of Able Archer, yes. They recommended increased readiness, yes. But they also included caveats. They acknowledged uncertainty. They admitted that the data could be interpreted multiple ways, and those caveats, those admissions of uncertainty, gave military commanders room to hesitate. It wasn't a definitive, "This is an attack, launch everything now." It was, "This looks suspicious, be prepared, but wait for confirmation." That's not as dramatic as a hero slamming his fist on a table. and refusing to launch despite direct orders, but it's probably more accurate to what actually happened. The system didn't fail because someone heroically overrode it. The system worked, barely, because people used judgment instead of automatically following procedures. In the underground command bunkers beneath Moscow, where the final decisions about nuclear release would have been made, military officers were watching the situation unfold. They had the reports from the field. They knew about NATO's exercise, they knew about their own forces' elevated readiness. They understood that the machinery was in motion, that weapons were being armed, that crews were standing by. And they waited. They didn't wait because they were cowards or because they were indecisive. They waited because they were doing exactly what their training told them to do. Verify before acting. Don't launch on ambiguous information. Don't start a nuclear war unless you're certain. That certainty never came. The data stayed ambiguous. NATO continued its exercise, but no actual attack materialized. The bombers that Soviet intelligence had worried about never took off on strike missions. The missiles that might have been fueled for launch never launched. The warning time that should have been shrinking, the minutes between detecting an attack and having to respond, never collapsed to zero. So the officers in Moscow waited and waited. And as hours passed without any actual attack occurring, the interpretation of the intelligence began to shift. Maybe this really was just an exercise after all. Maybe NATO was just testing their systems in an unusually realistic way. Maybe the Americans weren't preparing to attack. The elevated readiness continued. You don't stand down immediately when you're dealing with nuclear weapons. But the urgency decreased. The sense of imminent danger receded. Preparations continued, but they continued as contingency rather than immediate response. And on November 11th, when Able Archer concluded, when NATO forces stood down and returned to normal status, when the exercise ended without any missiles flying or bombs dropping, Soviet military leadership could finally conclude with confidence. It had been a drill. Just a drill. A provocative, realistic, deeply unsettling drill, but not an actual attack. Orders went out to Soviet forces to return to normal readiness levels. Bombers were de-armed. Missiles stood down. Submarines returned to their patrol areas. The machinery of nuclear war, which had been humming at the edge of activation, powered down. And the people who had made the decisions to wait, to verify, to hesitate, they went back to their normal duties. They filed their reports. They conducted their debriefs. They moved on to the next crisis, the next intelligence assessment, the next decision. They didn't know they had saved the world. From their perspective, they had just done their jobs correctly. They had assessed ambiguous intelligence with appropriate caution. They had recommended prudent preparedness without overreacting. They had followed doctrine and maintained discipline. But that's exactly what saved us. Not heroism, not dramatic last-minute interventions, just professionals doing professional work with appropriate skepticism and thoroughness. We like to think that systems keep us safe. We build elaborate command structures and fail-safes and protocols precisely because we don't trust individual judgment. But in November 1983, the systems nearly failed. The system saw indicators of war and processed them according to programming. The system said, prepare to launch. It was people, imperfect, uncertain, frightened people, who stopped it. And the most terrifying thing about this entire story is that we don't actually know how close we came. Were we minutes from launch? Hours? Days? Did Soviet commanders have their fingers on the metaphorical trigger, one more piece of alarming intelligence away from giving the order? Or was the danger less immediate than it appeared? Were there additional safeguards and verification procedures that would have prevented launch, even if orders had been given? Did the system have more resilience than we give it credit for? The declassified documents don't tell us. The people who were there, when they speak about it at all, tend to downplay the danger. Military officers on both sides have a professional interest in maintaining that everything was under control, that procedures worked, as designed, that the risk was manageable. But the pattern of what happened suggests otherwise. The pattern suggests a system that came very, very close to catastrophic failure, held together only by individual humans making individual choices to pause, to question, to wait just a little longer before doing something irreversible. And if that's true, then we survived Able Archer not because we were smart or well prepared, or because our systems were robust. We survived because we were lucky. Lucky that the right people were in the right positions at the right time. Lucky that enough of them chose caution over protocol. Lucky that the ambiguity of the intelligence never quite resolved into certainty. That's not a comforting thought, because luck runs out eventually, and a world that depends on luck to avoid nuclear war is a world living on borrowed time. Chapter 7. The exercise ends. Able Archer. 83 concluded on November 11th, 1983. NATO. Commanders reviewed the results, assessed the performance of their communication systems, wrote up reports on lessons learned. From their perspective, the exercise had been a success. They had tested their procedures under realistic conditions. They had identified some weaknesses in coordination between member nations. They had practiced the unthinkable and proven that the systems could function. NATO stood down. Officers returned to normal duty. The simulated war ended, and everyone went back to the real Cold War, which seemed, by comparison, relatively stable. No public announcement was made about any danger. No press release went out saying, we just ran a drill and it nearly triggered a nuclear war. There was no presidential address, no emergency session of the United Nations, no hotline call between Washington and Moscow to smooth things over. The moment just quietly passed. Soviet forces gradually stepped down from alert. Aircraft returned to normal readiness. Missile units stood down. Whatever orders had been issued were rescinded. The intelligence reports that had alarmed Moscow were re-evaluated in the light of the exercise ending without any attack. Andropov and his advisors presumably concluded that they had been watching a drill after all, though how they came to that conclusion and when remains murky. Did they realise it before the exercise ended, or only after? Did someone in Soviet intelligence finally confirm it was a simulation? Or did they simply note that when Able Archer ended no missiles flew, and therefore it must have been fake? We don't fully know. What we do know is that the world continued as normal. People went to work, children went to school. The news that night in America probably led with something about Beirut or Grenada or the economy. In the Soviet Union, state media reported whatever state media reported in those days. No one told the public that they had been hours or days or perhaps just minutes away from annihilation, and for years, almost no one knew. Chapter 8. What was discovered later? The truth about Able Archer. 83 emerged slowly in fragments over the course of decades. It wasn't a single revelation. It was a gradual accumulation of declassified documents, debriefs of defectors, and the piecing together of intelligence reports that had been filed and forgotten. The first hints came from Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB colonel who was actually a British double agent. Gordievsky had been stationed in London during Able Archer and had sent reports back to Moscow about NATO activities. He was in a unique position. He knew what the British and NATO were actually doing, running an exercise, and he also knew how Moscow was interpreting those actions. In his reports to the KGB, Gordievsky described British preparations for Able Archer. He noted the participation of senior officials. He documented the increased security around certain facilities. He did exactly what Soviet intelligence had instructed him to do under Operation Ryan: watch for signs of Western preparations for nuclear war. But Gordievsky also knew that Able Archer was just a drill. He had access to British intelligence briefings. He understood it was a simulation, and he tried carefully to indicate this in his reports without compromising his cover. He would note that British officials were treating it as an exercise, that there was no sense of actual crisis in London, that normal life was continuing. Moscow ignored those qualifications. They saw what they wanted to see in his reports: confirmation that something big was happening in NATO, the nuance, the context, the signs that it was routine. All of that was filtered out. What reached decision-makers was the alarming parts: senior officials moving, security increasing, communications changing. After Gordievsky defected to the West in 1985, he revealed the extent of Soviet paranoia during Able Archer. In his debriefings with British intelligence, he described Operation Ryan in detail. He explained the checklist of indicators that Soviet agents had been instructed to watch for. He recounted the assessments that had been sent to Moscow and how they had been interpreted. Western intelligence agencies were stunned. They had assumed the Soviets understood Able Archer was an exercise. The possibility that Moscow had taken it seriously, that they had actually prepared to launch, had never occurred to them. Or if it had occurred to someone, that concern had never been elevated to decision makers. Throughout the late 80s and 90s, more documents were declassified. This process was slow and piecemeal. The end of the Cold War in 1991 opened some Soviet archives, but not all. Russian military and intelligence services remained secretive about their Cold War operations. What information did emerge often came from defectors, from captured documents, or from the gradual declassification of Western intelligence assessments. Analysts began reviewing what had happened in November 1983 with fresh eyes. Reports that had seemed routine at the time were suddenly alarming in hindsight. A CIA assessment from November 8, 1983, noted unusual Soviet Air Force activity in East Germany. At the time, this had been filed as a predictable response to NATO exercises. Reading it years later, with the knowledge that the Soviets had genuinely feared an attack, that same report became evidence of how close things had come to disaster. An NSA intercept log showed Soviet military communications shifting to higher security protocols on November 6th. Again, this had been noted but not flagged as critical. In hindsight, it indicated that Soviet forces were preparing for actual combat operations, not conducting exercises. Satellite imagery reviewed years later showed Soviet bombers being moved at bases across Eastern Europe during the Able Archer period. The original analysis had categorized this as routine repositioning. The reanalysis suggested it was dispersal for combat operations, getting aircraft spread out so they couldn't all be destroyed in a single strike. All these pieces of intelligence had been collected at the time, but they hadn't been assembled into a coherent picture that screamed emergency. The analysts watching in real time couldn't see the pattern because they were operating under the assumption that their own exercise was transparently just an exercise. In 2003, a previously classified President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board report was released. This document, prepared in 1990, reviewed the Able Archer incident using newly available information from defectors and declassified Soviet documents. Its conclusions were stark. The report stated that Able Archer 83 had brought the superpowers closer to nuclear war than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. It acknowledged that NATO had badly misjudged Soviet perception and that the exercise had been potentially dangerous. It noted that Soviet military forces had been placed on higher alert and that this had occurred without NATO's knowledge or intention. But even more significant than what the report said was when it said it. The report was written in 1990, 7 years after Able Archer. It was classified until 2003, 20 years after the event. Think about that timeline. Able Archer happened in 1983. The US government realised how dangerous it had been by 1990, and the American public wasn't told until 2003. An entire generation grew up never knowing that their parents had nearly been incinerated in a nuclear holocaust, triggered by a training exercise. Why the delay? Why keep it classified for another 13 years after the Cold War had ended and the Soviet Union had collapsed? The official explanation was, that the report contained sensitive information about intelligence sources and methods. Releasing it earlier might have compromised ongoing operations or revealed capabilities that needed to remain secret. But there's another interpretation. Acknowledging how close we came to accidental nuclear war would have required admitting that the entire framework of nuclear deterrence had been far more fragile than anyone wanted to believe. It would have meant confronting uncomfortable questions about whether the system that was supposed to keep us safe had actually been the greatest threat to our survival. Western analysts who reviewed the incident in subsequent years came to some disturbing conclusions. One finding was that NATO's exercise design had been fundamentally flawed. By making Able Archer so realistic, by changing procedures from previous years, by incorporating high-level leadership participation, without adequately communicating these changes to the Soviets, NATO had created conditions ripe for misperception. Another finding was that intelligence sharing between NATO and the Warsaw Pact was dangerously inadequate. Both sides monitored each other constantly, but there were no effective mechanisms for clarifying intent. When something unusual happened, there was no quick way to say, "This is just an exercise, don't worry." The assumption was that both sides would recognise routine activities as routine. Able Archer proved that assumption wrong. A third finding, perhaps most troubling, was that Operation Ryan had created a self-fulfilling prophecy dynamic. Soviet intelligence was looking for signs of an American first strike. When they found those signs, or thought they did, they responded by preparing their own forces. Those preparations then looked, from the American side, like Soviet aggression, or at minimum like concerning military activity, which could have prompted American responses, which the Soviets would have interpreted as further confirmation of attack preparations, creating a spiral of misperception and response that could have ended in catastrophe. Some researchers went further, suggesting that there may have been other close calls during the Able Archer period that remain classified or unknown. If the Soviets armed nuclear weapons at multiple bases, if submarine commanders received preparatory orders for launch, if missile crews began countdown procedures, we might not know the full extent of what happened. The Soviet Union collapsed, but not all its records were preserved or made available. Some participants have died, some documents were destroyed, some stories may never be told. In 2013, a 30th anniversary retrospective in Foreign Policy magazine quoted former NATO officials expressing surprise at how seriously the Soviets had taken the exercise. One retired general was quoted saying, "We had no idea. We were just doing our jobs, testing our systems. If someone had told us the Russians thought we were actually preparing to attack, we would have stopped immediately." That quote is revealing. It suggests that right up through 2013, 30 years after the event, some of the people who had participated in Able Archer still didn't fully grasp the danger. Or perhaps they did grasp it, but couldn't quite accept it. Because accepting it meant accepting that they had nearly triggered Armageddon through ignorance rather than malice, through lack of imagination rather than aggression. The official line became that Able Archer was a misunderstanding, a failure of communication, a case where both sides had legitimate reasons for their actions, but had misread each other's intentions. That framing is convenient. It's clinical. It treats Able Archer as a learning experience, a close call that taught valuable lessons about the importance of transparency and communication during military exercises. But it also downplays just how close we came. It sanitizes the terror. It suggests that the system worked, when in fact the system nearly destroyed everything. It implies that cooler heads prevailed, when what actually happened was that confused people in impossible situations made marginally correct choices based on incomplete information and tremendous uncertainty. The full declassification of Able Archer-related documents continues even today. Files are still being released, still being analysed. Researchers continue finding new details, new evidence of just how dangerous that week in November 1983 actually was. And each new revelation makes the original silence more troubling. Because if this was as close as the evidence now suggests, if we really were minutes or hours from nuclear launches, then the decision to keep it quiet for decades wasn't just about protecting intelligence sources. It was about protecting the myth that nuclear deterrence was stable and controlled and safe. That myth was important. It allowed people to sleep at night. It allowed governments to justify the enormous expense of nuclear arsenals. It allowed strategists to claim that MAD worked, that the balance of terror prevented war, that we had everything under control. Able Archer revealed that we didn't have everything under control, that the balance was more precarious than anyone wanted to admit, that nuclear war could start not from aggression, but from misunderstanding, not from intention, but from mistake. And that truth was deemed too dangerous to tell, at least for 20 years, maybe longer. Because even now, with many documents declassified, we still don't know everything. Some files remain closed, some participants remain silent, some truths may be buried forever. But what we do know is enough. Enough to understand that Able Archer 83 was far more dangerous than the official narrative suggested. Enough to recognise that we survived by margins too narrow to be comfortable. Enough to question whether the Cold War nuclear standoff was ever as stable as we told ourselves it was. Chapter 9. The Conspiracy Interpretation. Here's where we enter the realm of conspiracy theory, though perhaps it's better described as conspiracy analysis. Because the question isn't whether Able Archer happened, it demonstrably did. The question is, what were we told about it, and why? Conspiracy theorists argue that governments on both sides downplayed the risk to avoid public panic. If the truth had come out immediately, that a NATO exercise had nearly triggered Soviet nuclear launch procedures, the public would have demanded answers. They would have asked how leaders could be so reckless. They would have questioned the entire framework of nuclear deterrence. Deterrence only works if both sides believe the other is rational and predictable. Able Archer revealed that the system was neither. It showed that a routine military exercise could spiral into Armageddon based on misperception. It demonstrated that all the careful game theory and strategic planning could be undone by simple miscommunication. Admitting that publicly would have been catastrophic for the doctrine that kept the Cold War cold. So instead, the theory goes, both sides agreed to bury it. The Soviets didn't want to admit they'd been paranoid and nearly started a war over nothing. The Americans didn't want to admit they'd been careless and nearly triggered a holocaust with a training drill. Neither side had anything to gain from public disclosure. The conspiracy interpretation suggests that the world survived Able Archer by accident, not by design. That the systems we trusted to keep us safe had actually brought us to the brink. That the only reason we're alive to talk about it is that a few cautious individuals in the Soviet command structure happened to hesitate at the right moment, and that's a terrifying thing to admit. Because if Able Archer almost caused nuclear war, how many other close calls have there been? How many times have we teetered on the edge without knowing? How many near misses have been classified, buried, forgotten? The existence of Operation Ryan itself suggests that Soviet leadership believed a surprise. American first strike was not just possible but likely. Think about what that means. It means that for years, Soviet strategy was predicated on the assumption that the United States was actively planning to annihilate them. And American strategy was based on the assumption that the Soviets thought the same thing in reverse. Two superpowers, each convinced the other was preparing to attack first, each building weapon systems designed to launch on warning, each watching the other with intelligence programs designed to spot the slightest sign of preparation. It's a miracle we survived. And the conspiracy theory says, maybe our survival wasn't because of good planning or strong leadership or effective deterrence. Maybe it was just luck. Maybe we rolled the dice 100 times, 1,000 times, and happened not to come up snake eyes until the whole game ended with the fall of the Soviet Union. That's not a comforting thought. It suggests that nuclear deterrence was always more fragile than we were told, that the Emperor had no clothes, that the experts didn't actually have everything under control, that we were all living on borrowed time and didn't know it. And if that's true, then the conspiracy wasn't a cover-up of malice. It was a cover-up of incompetence and terrifying randomness. Chapter 10. Why we never talk about it. Ask most people about near-nuclear disasters, and they'll mention the Cuban Missile Crisis. Some might know about Stanislav Petrov. A few might reference accidents like broken arrows or false alarms, but Able Archer, it's barely discussed outside of specialist circles. Why? Partly, it's because nothing actually happened. The Cuban Missile Crisis had visible drama. Ships, blockades, Kennedy on television, Khrushchev banging his shoe. It had narrative clarity. Able Archer was invisible. It happened in bunkers and command posts and encrypted radio traffic. There were no photos, no speeches, no public confrontations. Near misses without explosions are easy to bury. They don't generate compelling headlines. They don't make good movies. They're abstract, technical, difficult to explain. But there's another reason we don't talk about Able Archer, and it's more disturbing. Acknowledging it means acknowledging how fragile everything was. The Cold War narrative we tell ourselves is one of steady hands and rational actors. We frame it as a dangerous but manageable standoff, kept stable by smart leaders and careful diplomacy. We tell a story where the system worked, where deterrence held, where wisdom prevailed. Able Archer complicates that narrative. It suggests that we survived not because of brilliant strategy, but despite catastrophic miscommunication. It implies that the whole edifice of nuclear deterrence was built on assumptions that turned out to be wrong. Both sides assumed the other would recognise a drill as a drill. They were wrong. Both sides assumed their intelligence was good enough to distinguish simulation from reality. They were wrong. Both sides assumed that escalation could be controlled, that there were enough safeguards and checks and balances to prevent accidental war. And they were very nearly wrong about that too. Talking about Able Archer means confronting the possibility that we didn't end the Cold War through skill or virtue, but through sheer dumb luck. That we made it to 1991 not because we were smart enough or careful enough, but because we were lucky enough. And that's a hard thing to accept. It means that all the sacrifices, all the defence spending, all the carefully crafted strategies might have been for nothing. It means that the thing that saved us wasn't MAD or SDI or any acronym, it was chance. The real horror of Able Archer isn't that someone intended to start a war. It's that no one did. Both sides were following their procedures. Both sides were acting rationally according to their information. Both sides thought they were being prudent and careful. And they almost destroyed the world anyway. That's worse than malice. Malice can be opposed. Mistakes can be corrected. But systemic failure, the kind where everyone does their job right and disaster happens anyway, that's existential terror. So we don't talk about it. We remember the crises that were resolved, the moments where leadership made a difference, the times when the system worked. We don't dwell on the times it almost didn't, because dwelling on that means questioning whether any of it was ever really under control. Epilogue. The silence after Able Archer. 83 ended on November 11th, 1983. The Cold War continued for another 8 years. Missiles remained in silos. Submarines prowled the oceans. Bombers flew their routes. The world kept turning, kept building, kept living under the shadow of potential annihilation. But something had changed, even if the public didn't know it. Reagan, according to some accounts, was shaken by reports of how seriously the Soviets had taken the exercise. He had believed his rhetoric about the evil empire was just that, rhetoric. He hadn't fully grasped that Moscow might genuinely fear an American first strike. Able Archer gave him a different perspective. Some historians credit it with softening his approach in his second term, with making him more willing to negotiate with Gorbachev when the opportunity arose. In Moscow, the incident reinforced existing paranoia, but also highlighted the danger of misperception. Soviet leadership began to understand that their own fear could be as dangerous as any American weapon. Neither side made dramatic changes. There was no hotline conversation where they agreed to be more careful, but there were subtle shifts. Military exercises became slightly less provocative. Intelligence sharing improved marginally. The superpowers learned, without ever quite admitting it, that they had to be more transparent about their actions or risk stumbling into the war neither wanted. The Cold War did not end because systems were perfect. It ended because at critical moments people paused. Because someone, somewhere, in the Soviet chain of command in November 1983 looked at the data and decided to wait. Because enough individuals, whose names we may never know, chose verification over assumption, caution over protocol, peace over procedure. We survived Able Archer 83. We survived the Cold War. But we survived by margins that would horrify us if we fully understood them. The most dangerous war in history, a nuclear war that never happened, almost began as a training exercise. It almost started not because of aggression or ideology or conflict, but because of confusion. Because one side's simulation looked to the other side exactly like the real thing. And the silence that followed, the decades of not talking about it, tells us something important. Sometimes the closest calls are the ones we're least willing to acknowledge. Because acknowledging them means admitting that we were never really in control, that the systems we built to keep us safe were themselves the danger, that we trusted our lives to mechanisms that could fail in ways we never imagined. Able Archer was supposed to be a drill. It was supposed to be predictable, routine, safe. Instead, it became a week where the world balanced on a knife's edge, where nuclear forces prepared for launch, where the apocalypse was averted not by grand strategy, but by individual human beings who chose, in the moment, not to press the button. They didn't know they were saving the world. They probably thought they were just being cautious, just following their training, just doing their jobs, with appropriate care. But that's exactly the point. The world didn't end because heroes rose to the occasion. It didn't end because someone made a brilliant decision or took a courageous stand. It didn't end because anonymous, ordinary people doing ordinary jobs made ordinary choices to double-check, to verify, to wait just a little longer before doing something irreversible. The week the world almost ended teaches us that nuclear war doesn't require villains. It doesn't need madmen or warmongers or evil empires. It just needs two sides who misunderstand each other, who assume they know what the other is thinking, who build systems so complex and tightly coupled that a single miscalculation can trigger catastrophe. And the conspiracy, if there is one, isn't that Able Archer was invented or exaggerated. It's that we were never told how bad it really was. That the people who knew, who understood we'd been seconds or minutes or hours from the end, chose silence, chose to let the world continue in ignorance rather than confront the truth. Maybe they were right. Maybe the public couldn't have handled knowing. Maybe the panic would have been worse than the secret. Or maybe we deserve to know. Maybe we still deserve to know every time the world almost ends, every time the systems fail, every time we survive by accident rather than design. Because Able Archer wasn't unique. It was just the most dramatic example of a problem that persisted throughout the Cold War. The problem of two armed camps staring at each other in the dark, each seeing threats in every shadow, each ready to fire at the slightest provocation. We made it through. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War ended. We tell ourselves we won. But maybe the real lesson of Able Archer 83 is that nobody wins in a game where the penalty for losing is extinction. We didn't win the Cold War. We survived it. And we survived it, in part, because of luck we didn't know we needed. The silence. After Able Archer is the silence of people who looked into the abyss and decided not to describe what they saw. It's the silence of governments that realised they'd been far more reckless than they understood. It's the silence of a world that came within a heartbeat of ending and then just went on. Went back to work. Went back to school. Went back to life. And maybe that silence, that collective decision not to dwell on how close we came, was its own form of survival mechanism. Maybe we needed to forget in order to function. Maybe the full weight of knowing that we almost died, all of us, everyone, the entire human project, would have been too much to bear. But the story remains. The documents exist. The truth is out there, buried in declassified files and academic studies, and the memories of people who were there and knew what was happening and never told. Able Archer 83 was the week the world almost ended. It was the crisis that almost wasn't survived. It was the moment when the machinery of a nuclear deterrence, the system we built to keep us safe, nearly killed us all. And the fact that we're here, that you're listening to this, that we exist to tell the story, that's not because the system worked. It's because, for just long enough people in the right places made the right choices for the right reasons. And that's a terrifying thing to stake the survival of civilization on. But it's exactly what we did. Before we begin tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content here on Sleep Theories, please consider using your hype points on this video. It truly helps the channel grow more than you could possibly know, and it allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the unexplained. Also, if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, but only if you want to share. Now let's get into tonight's investigation. What if the child who came home wasn't entirely the same child who disappeared? There's a photograph that haunts the internet. You've probably seen it. A small boy, dirty and exhausted, wrapped in a blanket, staring into a camera with eyes that seemed far too old for his face. The rescue photo from June 2022, taken moments after 3-year-old Riker Webb was found alive in the Montana wilderness after vanishing for 2 terrifying nights. The world celebrated a miracle. Parents everywhere felt relief wash over them. Search and rescue teams were praised as heroes. The story had a happy ending. But if you look closer at that photograph, if you read between the lines of the official reports, if you listen to the whispers from Lincoln County, Montana, you'll find something else entirely. Something that suggests the miracle wasn't as simple as a lucky find. Something that implies those 2 days in the woods changed more than just a frightened child's perspective. This is the story of what really happened to Riker Webb, or at least what might have happened. Because the truth, as you'll soon discover, has been carefully managed, quietly buried, and deliberately obscured. My name is Elena Ferguson, and I'm a journalist from Spokane, Washington. I spent a year investigating this case, and what I found will make you question everything you thought you knew about missing children, wilderness survival, and the things that live in places humans rarely venture. Intro: the photo that never made sense. June 5, 2022, Montana. When Riker Webb walked out of those woods, when search teams found him inside an abandoned shed nearly 2 miles from his home, the relief was universal. News outlets ran the story with headlines like "Miracle in Montana" and "Toddler beats the odds." His parents wept with joy. The community of Troy, a tiny outpost in Lincoln County with barely 1,000 residents, exhaled collectively. But I remember seeing that photograph for the first time and feeling something other than relief. Call it journalistic instinct or maybe just human intuition. But something was wrong with the picture. Not technically wrong. The image was clear enough. The rescue workers looked appropriately concerned. The blanket wrapped around the boy was standard issue emergency gear. It was his face that bothered me. His hair looked different. Matted, yes, from 2 nights in the rain, and cold. But there was something about the way it framed his features that seemed older somehow, as if he had aged more than 48 hours. His expression didn't match what you would expect from a 3-year-old who just endured a terrifying ordeal alone in bear country. There was no crying, no reaching for parents, no visible fear or relief. Just this calm, almost watchful stare. And his eyes. God, his eyes looked wrong. Not injured or diseased, but wrong in a way I couldn't articulate then and still struggle to explain now. They looked like they'd seen something no child should see. Something no adult should see, for that matter. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Online forums began picking apart the photograph within hours. Reddit threads spawned conspiracy theories. Facebook groups dedicated to missing persons cases flagged the image as unusual. Most of it was the typical internet noise, people seeing patterns where none existed, making mountains from molehills. But some of the observations were harder to dismiss. Someone pointed out that Riker's skin tone seemed different in the rescue photo compared to family pictures taken weeks earlier. Another noted that the way he held his hands seemed too controlled for a traumatized toddler. A retired pediatric nurse commented that his facial expressions suggested a developmental age inconsistent with 3 years old. The mainstream media ignored these observations, as they should have. Conspiracy theories about missing children are dangerous territory, and most of the speculation was baseless. Most of it, but not all of it. Because as I dug deeper, as I travelled to Troy and started interviewing people who were actually there, who actually participated in the search, who actually saw Riker in those first hours after he was found, I realised the official story had holes. Big holes. The kind of holes that exist because the truth has been carefully excavated and replaced with something more palatable. This is that truth, or as close as I could get to it. Act 1. The real timeline. Let me start with what we know for certain. The documented facts that nobody disputes. June 3, 2022. Late afternoon, around 4 o'clock, Riker Webb disappeared from his family's yard on Deerwood Lane in Troy, Montana. He'd been playing outside while his parents worked on household projects. The yard backed up to dense wilderness, the kind of thick forest that characterises northwestern Montana, all Douglas fir and western larch, with underbrush so dense you can't see 10 feet in any direction. One moment he was there, the next he wasn't. His parents called the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office immediately. By evening, a full-scale search operation was underway. Ground teams, ATVs, tracking dogs, air support with helicopters, everything you'd mobilise for a missing child in mountain country. The conditions were brutal. Temperatures that night dropped into the low 40s. Heavy rain moved through the area. This was wilderness where mountain lions prowled and black bears were common. The terrain was unforgiving, full of cliffs and ravines and abandoned mining cabins from Montana's resource extraction past. The search continued through June 4th and into June 5th. 72 hours of coordinated effort involving dozens of volunteers, professional search and rescue teams, and law enforcement from multiple agencies. Then, on the morning of June 5, almost exactly 48 hours after he vanished, Riker was found inside a shed on Pine Ridge Road, approximately 2 miles from his home. According to the official report, he was dirty, hungry, quiet, and alert. He showed signs of exposure but no serious injuries. He was taken to a hospital for evaluation, checked out as remarkably healthy given the circumstances, and returned to his grateful parents. Case closed. Miracle achieved. Happy ending secured. Except for the details that didn't make the news, the observations that were logged and then buried, the witness statements that were taken and then classified, the evidence that suggested Riker's survival wasn't miraculous. It was impossible. Let me walk you through what I found. Act 2. The first lies. The shed owner was a man named Reginald Dixon, a retired logger in his 70s, who lived about a quarter-mile from the structure where Riker was discovered. I interviewed him at his home, a modest cabin that smelled like wood smoke and old coffee. Reginald was cooperative but clearly uncomfortable. He told me the shed had been locked the last time he checked it, over a week before Riker disappeared. He hadn't stored food there, no blankets, no supplies that might help a child survive. Just tools, he said, staring at his hands. Old equipment I don't use much anymore. The door had a padlock on it. I'm certain of that. But when the search team found Riker, I pressed, the door was open. Wide open, he confirmed. Lock was gone. Never found it. Could Riker have opened it himself? Reginald looked at me like I'd suggested the child could fly. He's 3 years old, miss. That lock required a key. Even if it didn't, even if it was somehow left unlocked, the door swelled from rain. I had to put my shoulder into it last time I opened it. A grown man's shoulder. So someone else opened it. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said something that stuck with me. Something opened it. That's all I know for certain. The distinction felt important. I pushed further, asking about Riker's condition when he was found. Reginald hadn't been present for the discovery, but he'd spoken to the search team members who were. They said he looked cold but not hypothermic, Reginald recalled. Which doesn't make sense, does it? 2 nights in the 40s with rain? A child that small should have been in serious trouble, but his core temperature was apparently fine, like something kept him warm. The shed itself. That shed has gaps in the walls you could stick your finger through. It's not insulated. It barely keeps the rain out. I thanked Reginald for his time and moved on to my next source, but his words echoed in my mind. Something opened it. Something kept him warm. Not someone. Something. My next breakthrough came through a Freedom of Information Act request I'd filed months earlier. The search and rescue logs finally arrived, heavily redacted but still revealing. Most of it was standard documentation. Team assignments, search grid coordinates, timing of various sweeps through the forest. But scattered throughout were observations that painted a very different picture than the official narrative. June 4, 11:23 a.m. Thermal anomaly detected on ridge approximately 1.3 miles northeast of last known position. Negative on visual confirmation. Signature disappeared before ground team arrival. June 4, 2:47 p.m. Multiple thermal signatures appear and disappear rapidly in Sector 7. Equipment malfunction suspected but unconfirmed. Signatures do not match known wildlife patterns. June 4, 7:15 p.m. Team 3 reports audible childlike vocalization from unreachable location. Cliff face prevents access. Vocalization ceased before climbing equipment deployed. And then the entry that made my hand shake when I read it. June 4, 9:03 p.m. Eyes in the tree line. Size inconsistent with known wildlife. Recommend daylight follow-up. Location marked. This entry was written by a volunteer firefighter named Marcus Tully. I tracked him down to a bar in Libby, about 30 miles south of Troy. He refused to talk to me at first, literally walked away when I introduced myself and mentioned Riker's case. It took 3 visits, and finally buying him dinner before we'd even acknowledge being on the search team. "I don't talk about that night," he said, pushing food around his plate. "I was told not to talk about that night." Told by who? He looked up at me, and I saw genuine fear in his eyes. People who made it clear my cooperation was appreciated and my silence was expected. "What did you see, Marcus?" He was quiet for a long time, then so softly I almost missed it. Something watching us. Something big enough that the eyes were level with mine and I'm 6 feet tall. But it was crouched in the brush, I could tell by the angle. If it stood up. He didn't finish the sentence, he didn't need to. "Did you tell the search coordinators?" "I logged it. You've seen the log, so you know I logged it. They told me it was probably a bear standing on its hind legs. But I've seen bears, miss. I've seen them up close. That wasn't a bear." "What was it?" "I don't know," he said, meeting my eyes. "And I don't want to know. I've got a family. I've got a life here. Some questions aren't worth asking." I had one more question for him, though. "The helicopter footage," I said. "The FLIR imaging from the air search. Have you seen it?" His expression darkened. "It doesn't exist. Officially. But unofficially. Unofficially, the pilot saw something he wasn't supposed to see. Unofficially, that footage was classified faster than you can blink. Officially, there was a malfunction, and no usable imagery was captured." I managed to track down the pilot, a man named Sam Keller, who worked for a private helicopter service contracted by the county. He was even more reluctant to talk than Marcus, but I caught him at the right moment after a few drinks at a hangar party when his guard was down. "I saw something moving behind that kid," he told me, words slightly slurred. In the thermal image, clear as day, something big crouched down like it was, I don't know, hiding, protecting him. The shape was wrong for a person, too tall, too thin, but it was there, right behind where we found him the next morning. What happened to the footage? 2 guys in suits showed up at my office 6 hours after the search ended. Didn't identify themselves, just said the footage was part of an ongoing investigation, and they were confiscating the storage drives. I never saw them again, never got the drives back. When I asked the county about it, they told me there was no record of any confiscation. As far as they're concerned, the footage never existed. He looked at me with bloodshot eyes. But I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't nothing. Act 3. Local legends. Local fear. The Kootenai tribe has lived in this region for thousands of years. Long before Montana was Montana, long before white settlers arrived with their maps and mining claims. Their reservation isn't far from Troy, and I'd heard rumours that some of the tribal elders had knowledge about the forest that went beyond simple folklore. It took time to build trust, to find someone willing to talk to an outsider about sensitive subjects. But eventually, through a contact at the Tribal Cultural Centre, I was introduced to an elder named Joseph Running Bear. We met at his home, a modest house surrounded by pines, where he served me tea and studied me with eyes that seemed to see more than I was comfortable with. "You're asking about the Webb boy," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Mr. Running Bear. I'm trying to understand what happened to him." He nodded slowly. "The forest near Troy has been different. For as long as our people have memory, we have stories about that place. Old stories." "What kind of stories?" "Stories about the mimics, the lost ones, the things that live in the deep woods and sometimes take interest in humans, especially children." He poured more tea, taking his time, choosing his words carefully. "Our legends speak of beings that can imitate human voices, especially the voices of children. They call out in the dark, leading people astray. But sometimes, rarely, they do the opposite. Sometimes they protect. Protect who? The innocent, the vulnerable, children who wander into their territory." I felt a chill run through me despite the warm tea. "Why would they do that?" Joseph shrugged. "The stories don't explain their motivations. Maybe they're lonely. Maybe they remember being human once if they ever were. Maybe they operate on logic we can't understand. But the pattern is consistent. Some who go missing in those woods return, and some who return are not quite the same." "Not the same how?" He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "They come back changed. Sometimes physically, sometimes in behaviour, sometimes in ways harder to define. Like they've seen something, experienced something, that fundamentally altered them. The eyes are usually what people notice first. The eyes look older. My hands were shaking. I set down the teacup. "Has this happened before? With other children?" "I cannot speak to specific cases," he said carefully, "but I can tell you that the area around Bull Lake Road and Pine Ridge Road has a history. Our people avoided certain parts of that forest traditionally. We marked them as places where the boundary between worlds is thin." After leaving Joseph's home, I went to the Lincoln County Courthouse and started digging through old records, missing persons cases going back decades. What I found was disturbing in its consistency. 7 missing child cases since 1960, all within a 2-mile radius of Pine Ridge Road. 3 found alive, all with memory gaps, all describing similar experiences. Darkness, cold, then warmth, a presence that felt protective rather than threatening, and finally being led or carried to a place where humans could find them. The other 4 were never found. The 3 survivors all exhibited behavioural changes after their return. Withdrawal, night terrors, unusual maturity for their age. In each case, the official explanation was trauma from being lost in the wilderness. But reading between the lines, reviewing old police reports and newspaper articles, I could see the pattern Joseph had described. Something in that forest takes an interest in lost children. Sometimes it returns them, but they come back different. I managed to track down a woman who taught at Riker's preschool, though she insisted on anonymity. We met at a coffee shop in Kalispell, far enough from Troy that she felt safe talking. "He changed after he came back," she told me, stirring her coffee nervously. "I mean, you'd expect some trauma response, right? A child going through something that frightening. But it was more than that." "How so?" "He was more withdrawn, yes. The night terrors were bad, according to his parents, but there was also this maturity. Like he'd suddenly understood things he shouldn't understand at 3 years old. The way he'd look at you sometimes, it was like being evaluated by an adult in a child's body." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "He kept talking about the other boy. Said the other boy was nice, that the other boy kept him warm, that the other boy told him stories." "Did his parents mention this?" "They told me he was just processing the trauma through imagination, creating an imaginary friend to cope with being alone, but But what? One day, about a month after he came back, he was drawing in class. I looked over his shoulder and saw he'd drawn 2 figures. When I asked him who they were, he said, "Me and him." I asked who him was, and he looked at me like I was stupid. He said, "The other boy. He said he'd stay in the woods so I could come home. He said it was a fair trade." She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. I mentioned it in a report to the school counsellor. 2 days later, I was called into the principal's office with a county official I'd never met. They told me that spreading rumours about the Webb case was harmful to the family and potentially actionable. They strongly suggested I focus on Riker's present well-being and stop dwelling on his statements about the experience. They threatened you. They didn't have to threaten explicitly. The message was clear. Stop talking about this, or there will be consequences. Act 4. The eyewitness who breaks the case. For months, I'd been trying to find someone from the original search team willing to go on record with details that contradicted the official story. Most refused outright. Others simply stopped returning my calls. The culture of silence around the Webb case was ironclad. Then I got a call from a number I didn't recognise. The voice on the other end was elderly, male, hesitant. "Miss Ferguson, my name is Benjamin Hartley. I understand you've been investigating what happened to the Webb boy. I think we should talk." We met at his home outside Troy, a small ranch house with a view of the Cabinet Mountains. Benjamin was in his late 60s, a retired contractor who'd volunteered with search and rescue teams for over 30 years. "I was there," he said simply, once we'd settled in his living room. "I was on the team that found him." My heart rate picked up. "Can you tell me what you saw?" He pulled out a folder, old and worn, and handed it to me. "These are copies I made before I turned in my official report. I knew even then that something wasn't right about how the whole thing was being handled. Inside were photographs, notes, sketches, evidence that had never made it into the public record. "We found footprints," Benjamin said, pointing to one of the photos, next to where Riker had been. Small footprints consistent with a child his size, but there were others. The photograph showed depressions in the mud near the shed. Alongside the small prints were larger ones, much larger, and they were barefoot. "Human?" I asked. "Shaped like human feet," Benjamin corrected, but the proportions were wrong. Too long, too narrow, and the stride length suggested something tall, very tall. How tall? Based on them spacing, I'd estimate 7 feet, maybe more. He showed me another photograph, this one showing drag marks in the dirt. These led to the shed, short marks like something was being carried. The spacing and depth suggested significant weight, more than a 3-year-old child, like whatever was carrying him was heavy enough to sink deeper into the ground. Could it have been an animal? A bear? Benjamin shook his head. "I've tracked animals my whole life. These weren't animal prints. And there were these other impressions." He pointed to circular marks in another photograph. We couldn't figure out what made these. They were too regular to be natural, too random to be man-made. One of the guys on my team said they looked like a deer standing on its hind legs might make, but that's absurd. What did the sheriff's office say? They told us to exclude the unusual prints from our official report, said it would confuse the investigation and distract from the main goal of finding Riker safe. When I pointed out that Riker had already been found, they changed their reasoning, said it would traumatise the family to know something else had been near their son, said we should focus on the positive outcome and not create unnecessary fear. He leaned back, looking tired. But here's the thing that really bothered me. When we actually found Riker, when we approached the shed, the door was standing wide open, not just unlocked, open, like something had just left. "Did you see anything?" "No, but I felt it. We all felt it. Something watching us from the tree line. Something that disappeared the moment we got close to the boy." Benjamin reached into his pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. I recorded part of the search team briefing that morning. I wasn't supposed to, but I had a feeling things were about to get strange. I was right. He played the recording for me. The audio quality was poor, but I could make out voices discussing the search plan. Then clearly a deputy's voice. We are classifying the unidentified presence as environmental. Do not report visual details in your statements. Keep your descriptions limited to the child's condition and location. Another voice, one I didn't recognise. Higher authorities have already been contacted. They'll handle the anomalous elements. Your job is to stick to the facts. The simple facts. I looked at Benjamin. Higher authorities? No one ever identified who they were, but 2 unmarked vehicles showed up that afternoon. Federal plates. The men inside asked to review all our documentation. They were particularly interested in the photographs of the footprints and the thermal imaging data. What did they look like? Professional, clean-cut, the kind of people who are used to having authority and not explaining it. One of them, the one in the green jacket, interviewed several of us separately. He asked strange questions. Like what? He wanted to know if Riker had spoken to it. His exact word, it. Not who, not what, just it. He asked if the boy seemed older somehow, if he looked like himself. At the time, I thought the questions were bizarre. Now, he trailed off, looking out the window at the mountains. Now I think he knew exactly what we'd found, and he was checking to see if Riker had been changed by whatever was out there with him. Act 5. The conspiracy deepens. The more I investigated, the more layers I uncovered. What had started as a simple question about a missing child had evolved into something far more complex and disturbing. Through various sources, I'd learned that several agencies had been present during and immediately after Riker's rescue. The obvious ones were expected. Local search and rescue, Lincoln County Sheriff's deputies, Montana Fish, wildlife, and parks officers. But there were others. 2 unmarked federal vehicles had arrived the afternoon of June 5. No one could tell me which agency they represented. The men inside carried no visible identification, but had authority that local law enforcement immediately deferred to. One witness, a volunteer who'd been helping coordinate the search from a command post, told me the man in the green jacket had arrived with very specific questions that suggested prior knowledge. He knew there would be unusual elements before anyone told him, the witness said. He arrived asking about them, not whether they existed, but what they were specifically, like he'd been briefed in advance. The questions this man asked were telling. Did the boy speak to it? Did he seem older when you found him? Did he look like himself? Were there any physical changes you noticed? That last question bothered me most. Physical changes. As if such things were expected, anticipated even. Through a contact in the medical community who insisted on absolute anonymity, I learned something that chilled me to the bone. Riker's medical evaluation at the hospital showed anomalies. His cortisol levels were elevated far beyond what trauma alone would explain, suggesting exposure to extreme prolonged stress. But more significantly, the blood work showed cellular activity that the attending physician flagged as unusual. Unusual how? I'd asked. Like accelerated cellular turnover. Like his body had aged more than 2 days at a cellular level. The doctor wanted to run additional tests, but before she could, someone from administration came down and seized all the samples and paperwork. They said there had been a filing error and the tests needed to be redone at a different facility. Were they redone? Not as far as I know. The whole incident was classified as a clerical mistake and expunged from the record. But the doctor who initially examined him? She left the hospital 3 months later, moved out of state. When I asked her about it at her going-away party, she just said some questions weren't worth the answers. There was another detail that kept nagging at me, something so seemingly impossible I almost discarded it entirely. But journalism is about following the evidence, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. When search teams initially interviewed Riker about how he survived, his answers were inconsistent with the official narrative. According to multiple sources who were present but refused to go on record, Riker repeatedly mentioned the quiet boy. He said the quiet boy kept him warm. The quiet boy told him not to be scared. The quiet boy brought him to the shed where people could find him. The quiet boy said it was okay to go home now. Search teams scoured the area for any sign of another child. They found nothing. No footprints that matched a second child. No evidence anyone else had been in the shed. No missing persons reports for children in the region. The quiet boy didn't exist, except Riker insisted he did, and the details he provided were too consistent, too specific to be simple imagination. He described the quiet boy as tall like Daddy, and cold to touch, and didn't talk with his mouth. When pressed on what that last part meant, Riker apparently said the quiet boy talked in the quiet place, touching his own head. Telepathy. The child was describing telepathy. This detail was quickly dismissed as imagination by officials, but it was logged. Someone wrote it down. Someone thought it was significant enough to document before the sanitization of the official record. Ast 6. Return to Pine Ridge Road. A year after Riker disappeared, I returned to Pine Ridge Road with camera equipment and a thermal imaging device borrowed from a friend in wildlife research. I wanted to see the site for myself, to walk the ground where something impossible had occurred. The shed was still there, more weathered now, door hanging loosely on rusted hinges. I approached carefully, documenting everything with my camera. The interior was exactly as Benjamin had described. Empty, dilapidated, gaps in the walls large enough to see through. No insulation, no supplies. Nothing that would help a small child survive 2 nights of cold and rain. I was about to leave when I noticed something in the dirt floor near the back wall. Fresh tracks, recent tracks. I knelt down, examining them carefully. A footprint. Larger than a child's, smaller than an adult's, barefoot. The proportions were wrong, elongated, just like in Benjamin's photographs. My hands were shaking as I took pictures. This print couldn't be more than a few days old, maybe a week at most. The edges were too clean, the definition too sharp. Something had been here recently. I expanded my search, circling the shed, looking for more evidence. Under a rock about 20 feet from the structure, I found something that made my blood freeze. A drawing. A child's drawing, done in crayon on what looked like paper from a fast food restaurant placemat. The crayon and paper were faded but still recognisable. The drawing showed 2 figures. One was small, clearly meant to be a child, labelled me in shaky letters. The other was taller, much taller, with elongated limbs and large dark eyes. It was labelled him. The proportions of the tall figure were disturbing. The arms reached past the knees. The fingers were too long. The eyes were solid black, taking up too much of the face. This was Riker's drawing. It had to be. The style matched what a 3-year-old could produce. But how did it get here? Had his parents brought him back to the site? Had he left it here himself during some return visit? Or had something else placed it here, preserved under a rock, waiting to be found? I pocketed the drawing and continued my investigation as the sun began to set. I'd planned to leave before dark, but something compelled me to stay. Call it journalistic dedication or morbid curiosity. I wanted to experience the site the way Riker had experienced it. At night, alone, vulnerable. I set up my thermal camera on a tripod, pointing it at the tree line, and settled in for a long night. Act 7. The thing that watches. Around midnight, the forest changed. I can't explain exactly how. The ambient noise didn't stop, the temperature didn't drop dramatically, there was no obvious shift in the environment. But something changed. The quality of the darkness felt different, heavier, more attentive. Then I heard it. A child laughing. High and clear and completely out of place in the deep woods after midnight. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, but saw nothing. The laughter continued, moving through the trees with impossible speed, first to my left, then to my right, then behind me. My rational mind screamed that it was an animal, a fox or a bird, something with a call that mimicked human sounds. But my instinct knew better. This was laughter. Human laughter. A child's laughter. Then it spoke. "Hello?" A child's voice. Riker's voice. I recognised it from news footage I'd watched dozens of times, but Riker was miles away, safe at home with his parents. "Hello? Are you lost?" The voice was getting closer. I fumbled with my thermal camera, pulling up the display screen with trembling hands. 2 heat signatures appeared in the image. One was child-sized, standing about 30 yards into the tree line. The other was larger, much larger, crouched behind the first. The proportions were wrong. The limbs too long, the torso too narrow, the head too large. I watched, frozen, as the smaller signature moved toward me. The larger one stayed back, unmoving, just watching. "Are you lost?" the child's voice asked again, now close enough that it should have been visible even in the darkness. But I saw nothing with my eyes. Only the thermal camera showed the approaching heat signature. When it was about 15 feet away, it stopped. The larger signature behind it shifted, rising slightly as if preparing to move. Then both vanished. Not gradually, not walking away, just gone, as if they'd been switched off. I sat there in the darkness for another hour, shaking, watching the thermal display for any sign of their return. Nothing. The forest was empty. At dawn, I packed up my equipment and examined the area where the signatures had been. The ground was soft from recent rain. There should have been footprints if something physical had been there. There were. Small barefoot prints, child-sized, and larger ones behind them, the same elongated proportions as the print I'd found in the shed. They led deeper into the forest, toward the ridge where search teams had reported thermal anomalies during Riker's disappearance. I followed them for about 100 yards before they simply ended at the base of a large cedar tree. Not faded, not obscured, just ended, as if whatever made them had ceased to exist at that exact spot. Conclusion. What came back? I spent another 2 months investigating, interviewing more witnesses, filing more records requests, trying to build a coherent picture of what happened in those woods. The truth, as best as I can determine it, is this. Riker Webb wandered into the forest on June 3, 2022. Something found him there. Something old. Something that lives in the places humans rarely go. Something that operates on logic we don't understand. This something kept him alive. Protected him from the cold, the rain, the predators. Led him to a structure where humans would eventually find him. And then, when rescuers arrived, it disappeared back into the wilderness. But protection came with a price. Riker returned physically unharmed but fundamentally changed. His eyes looked older because he'd seen something humans aren't meant to see. His behaviour changed because he'd experienced something children shouldn't experience. His memory gaps exist because some knowledge is too dangerous to retain consciously. The government knew about this. Maybe not specifically, maybe not in advance, but they had protocols in place. They arrived quickly, they seized evidence, they suppressed unusual details, they intimidated witnesses into silence. Which suggests this has happened before. The pattern of missing children in that area going back decades, the tribal legends about the mimics and the lost ones, the federal response that was too coordinated to be improvised. Something lives in those woods near Troy, Montana. Something that occasionally takes an interest in lost children. Sometimes it returns them, but they always come back different. The official story says Riker Webb survived alone through luck and the resilience of children. The official story is a lie. A necessary lie, perhaps, because the truth would raise too many questions, create too much panic, fundamentally challenge our understanding of what shares this world with us. But the truth remains, hidden in redacted documents and suppressed testimonies, and the haunted eyes of a child who spent 2 nights in the presence of something impossible. Riker Webb didn't survive alone. Something helped him. Something the forest keeps hidden. Something that watches, even now, from the tree line. Something that returns children. But not always the same. I returned to the site one final time before leaving Montana. I stood at the edge of the forest, looking into the shadows between the trees, and I felt it watching me. Not threatening, not hostile, just observing, deciding perhaps if I was worth engaging with. I left the drawing I'd found under the same rock where I'd discovered it. I don't know why. It felt like the right thing to do, like returning something to its rightful owner. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. At the tree line, barely visible in the fading light, stood a figure. Too tall, too thin, too still to be human. It raised one elongated hand in what might have been a wave. Then it stepped back into the shadows and was gone. I haven't been back to Troy since. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the boundary between possible and impossible feels thin, I think about Riker Webb. I wonder what he remembers from those 2 days. I wonder what he was told by the quiet boy who kept him warm. I wonder what fair trade was made in that dark forest. And I wonder if, someday, something will come to collect. This has been the story of the 2 days Riker can't remember, or perhaps the 2 days he's not allowed to remember. The truth remains out there, in the woods near Troy, in the places humans rarely venture, in the shadows between the trees. Some mysteries are solved, some are buried, and some, like this one, simply wait in the darkness, patient and timeless, for the next lost child to wander into territory that was never really ours to begin with. Thank you for listening. Stay safe out there. And if you ever find yourself lost in the deep woods and something offers to help you find your way home, remember Riker's story before you accept, because protection always comes with a price. And sometimes the cost isn't paid until long after you think you've made it home safely. Good night.